Turkeys are hitting the ground.
Creating the internet.
Our signal's always clear. Internet radio, streaming live 24 hours a day.
In a world of the Para-X radio network lies a lounge with food for mind and soul, a place to gather, learn, and chat about the unexplained and paranormal while being served by your most congenial host, Reverend Tim Shaw. Next stop, the Black Cat Lounge, Thursdays at 8 p.m. Eastern on the Para-X radio network.
Hi, Barry McGuire here, inviting you to come along with Marla Brooks and let's start stirring the cauldron together on Para-X.
Stirring the Cauldron with Marla Brooks, Thursdays at 9 o'clock on Para-X. Welcome to Stirring the Cauldron. Now, here's your host, Marla Brooks.
Merry meet everybody, and welcome to Stirring the Cauldron here on the Para-X Radio Network. A little heads up, guys, if you hear any extraneous noises during tonight's broadcast, like groaning, coughing, sneezing, sniffling, or whining, it's not an EVP. Nor have I been possessed. I've just got a bad cold, so please forgive me if I don't hit the mute button in time. Now, that being said, we're going back in time, speaking of time, way back in time to ancient Greece with my guest, author Philip Coppens, who is the editor of Erich von Däniken's new book, Odyssey of the Gods, which takes a look back into the history of extraterrestrial contact in ancient Greece. Von Däniken, as I'm sure you're aware, is the author of the multi-million bestsellers Chariots of the God and Twilights of the God. Now, Philip is an author and investigative journalist, ranging from the world of politics to ancient history and mystery. He co-hosts the Spirit Revolution radio show with his partner Kathleen McGowan, and is a frequent contributor to Nexus Magazine and Atlantic Rising Magazine. Since 1995, he has lectured extensively and has appeared on a number of television and DVD documentaries, including Ancient Aliens on the History Channel. He's the author of The Stone Puzzle of Rosslyn Chapel, The Cannabis Revelation, Land of Gods, The New Pyramid Age, Servants of the Grail, and the ebook 2012, Science or Fiction. Now, if anyone has any questions or comments for Philip, and you're in the Para-X chat room, send me a private message and I'll pass them along. And if you want to get to the Para-X chat room, just come to www.para-x.com and click live chat. And since we've got a whole lot to cover in a short hour tonight, everyone, please welcome Philip Coppens. Hi, Philip, and thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Hi there, Marla, and thank you for having me on.
I was looking forward to this. It's such a fascinating book and such a fascinating subject. But being an author in your own right, how did you get involved with Mr. von Daniken and end up editing this fascinating book?
Well, I've known Erich since 1995, and I've spoken since 1995 at some of his world conferences, which basically, at that moment in time, was every 2 years, once in Europe, once in America, alternating, bringing about really a forum where people could speak about the subject of ancient aliens. And so I got involved with this conference and the magazine Legendary Times, Giorgio, as early as 1995. Now, this book basically wanted to, it's a reedition, and basically what New Page Books is doing is they are trying to get all of Erich's material up to date, as well as in English, and roughly at a pace of one book a year, which means that sometimes it's a new title which Erich is writing, but at this moment in time in his life, Erich is approaching 80, and as a result, he isn't the writer who can churn out manuscripts, so to speak, every year. So what they're really doing is alternating new material with updated material.
Mm-hmm. And I would kind of think, and that was actually going to be my next question, about the factors that might have regenerated interest for the re-release. There is a lot of new interest in the ancient aliens, and the fact that the gods in ancient Greece perhaps were aliens. So I think that was very, very good timing.
Well, there are several books out there, some of them which give very big theories, some of them which are very bespoke. But I think Erich and I, we have a similar style in approaching this subject, which is that we somewhat shy away from the big theories, and that we more try to write questioning books which kind of like show the reader that certain things they might not realize they kind of like have to look at some of material in with new eyes. And that's definitely the case, I think, with the ancient Greeks, because the ancient Greeks, we all think we know these stories, we all think we've grown up with them because hey, we study these things sometimes even in Greek as teenagers, and so we think we all know these stories. And what are we told as teenagers? I can remember from my own education that we had to sit down, read excerpts which were very fanciful, which didn't really make all that much sense, and the teacher kind of like guided us through and kind of said like, well, what the ancient Greeks are saying here is this. And it was very interesting, but at the same time also very questioning. And we were kind of like told at that moment in time as 14, 15-year-olds that somehow our mindset was different, that we don't really understand what the Greeks were saying because our minds had changed so much in comprehension. Well, what Erich is doing is this. Erich is saying, okay, really what everybody of us was grown up with is 5 translations down the line of what the original Greek texts are. And over these 5 translations, there's been so many editing by these translators. The problem is that the Greek myths have not just been translated, they have been edited. And so he goes back sometimes, to the original Greek, most of the time to more ancient translations, some of them which are like 200 years old. And what you see is something completely different. And in the book, he argues specifically, or he shows specifically, the story of Jason and the Argonauts. What we have here, if kind of look at it to modern eyes, this is a story of a Greek guy who gathers around a bunch of friends, says, hey, let's go somewhere and see whether we can get something back which seems to have been ours once, and now it's being held in this foreign country. And his mates say, oh yeah, okay, what's that? Well, it's the Golden Fleece. Yeah, that's fine, let's go and pick this back. And then you start reading a description of the golden fleece, and it appears as if it's, as Eric points out, just a bit of fur. What is so special about this thing that 50 people should go to a different country, jump in boat, and to some extent risk limb and life for this object? Well, it doesn't make any sense in the modern translation. So Eric goes back to the original ones. And what you find is so more interesting. First of all, the golden fleece is described as an object which seems to be able to fly. And this is why Jason is interested in this, because he basically says, there's this object in Colchis, and I really want to go and get it because it seems to be able to fly. And some of his friends say, well, we'll come with you. And amongst some of his friends, there are actually people who say or claim that they can navigate this, that they can pilot this object. And then what we also find is that, in the mythical accounts, if we assume that these are mythical, that this golden fleece is guarded by weird creatures, some of them who seem to be alive. Well, again, when you start going to the original ones, what you come up with is something slightly different. You're being confronted with creatures who seem to be having quite some regularity to this, in the sense that their breathing of fire and various other things is quite regular, and even seems to have on-off switches. And so, whereas 200 years ago there was nobody had home security systems and the like, but what seems to be clear is that the golden fleece does have, it's not a home security system, but definitely a security system. And we are, in a mindset today to understand those kind of things. And 200 years ago, they were, for our ancestors, kind of like, okay, what is this all about? We don't really get this. But something happened in those 200 years as well, and this is like the sadness of it, which is that we abandoned the original interpretations because we didn't understand them, and everybody began to assume that these things had to do with basically ancient science fiction, that somebody just wrote stories, and that we now all believe that these myths didn't exist. But our ancestors, the ancient Greeks themselves, they wrote them down. They wrote down these weird accounts and basically told their descendants, and to some extent, the people who were reading them, look, this is something which is weird. This is something which is anomalous. This is precisely why we wrote this down. This isn't ancient science fiction. This isn't even science fiction. This is really an account which either us or our ancestors held to be true. And that is really what Eric is doing with Odyssey of the Gods. He's saying we really need to look at the ancient Greek accounts in different eyes, and what we've always have believed in the past, within our lifetime, that all of these things were made up, that these were mythical, that these things didn't happen, that these things were, as I said, ancient science fiction. For the ancient Greeks weren't. The ancient Greeks were talking either about science or about facts.
Mm-hmm. Well, see, when I was young and read about the golden fleece, the thing that really stuck in my mind, and maybe it sounds stupid now, but I thought, okay, fleece comes from a sheep, okay, or a ram. So we have the sheep and the fleece, but then I heard that it's nailed to a tree. And I'm thinking, well, why would they skin a ram who would, bring more and more fleece, and how the hell is it flying? So it gets a little bit crazy, but less geared to point out anomalies, for lack of a better word, about the things we learned in school, about the ancient Greek culture and mythology. And many of these anomalies deal with the possibility of an extraterrestrial presence, right?
Yes, and I mean, it was highlighted in Ancient Aliens as well, and it goes onto the same subject matter. It's Zeus. Zeus has these things at his disposal, which are described as thunder and lightning, and he can use these. And because we know Zeus is quite a temperamental deity, he seems to use these quite often when he just is sometimes bored, and sometimes when he's angry at people, sometimes for not all the right reasons. So first of all, Zeus is this all-powerful being but he's also quite human. He displays extremely strong emotions and isn't always what I would call a just god. He's a bit too human. But when we start to look at kind of like when he does get upset with people or whatever, the demigods or the deities, he said that he has these weapons like thunder and lightning. And again, we believe that our ancestors somehow looked at nature, saw thunder, saw lightning, said, "Ooh, what is that?" And said, "Oh, there must be somebody controlling this. There must be somebody behind this. This must be animated." And it's fair enough assumption, but again, we are missing certain things, specifics to Zeus. And again, when you start going into the detail, you're beginning to realize that what's going on here is that our ancestors aren't saying thunder and lightning, but like thunder and lightning. And the comparison I like to use is this: when you say, okay, so we exploded the atom bomb, and in today's accounts, of course, we have television and we see these atomic explosions happening on television. But imagine that you're a newspaper, you don't have a photographer, or you're on the radio. How would you describe it? And the thing which always comes to the forefront is like the description as like giant mushrooms. Well, okay, let's drop the like, and at that moment in time, go forward in time with 500 years, say, and people were to be mistakenly identifying our time as saying that we somehow believed that there were explosions of giant mushrooms. That is not the case. But it's that kind of mindset whereby we believe that they were having thoughts about thunder and lightning. No, they describe it as like thunder and lightning, and that's the big difference.
Now, in the introduction to the book, it is said that the ancient Greeks were regaled with stories that one might call science fiction that date back to a millennia even before their own. How far back do these stories date, and what kind of stories are they?
They date back an awful lot of time, and it's the Greeks weren't the best timekeepers. When you look at ancient civilizations, you have the ancient Egyptians who speak of a time when the gods ruled over Egypt, and they are very specific that this is a time which roughly goes back roughly 20,000 years. So we have this period of time. The Greeks are not that good at it, but we can get somewhere along the lines. So we obviously know that the Greeks, the historical period of Greece, so to speak, was founded just after 800 BC. With the Olympic Games, which were held once again. We know to some extent that the Olympic Games were held slightly before, but there was no historical record for this. Eric briefly touches upon the story of Atlantis, to which we can return to if we have time and if we so want to do so. But basically, this is a story of the ancient Greeks who go to Egypt and find out that they are older than they think they are. Now that all of a sudden goes back, if you take the literal interpretation of Atlantis, 9,000 years. Now, leaving Atlantis aside, what the Greeks are saying is this, that there were 5 eras, that they were living in the time of iron, and before you have things like bronze, silver, gold. And when you go back, you also go back to a period where there were demigods, that there was a war of the Titans, that there was basically a war raged in heaven, and that before you have the arrival and the presence and the rule of the gods, specifically Zeus, from Mount Olympus. So when you start adding everything up, you kind of like can go, okay, this could be millions of years, or this could just be a few thousands of years. They weren't all that interested in dating. But I would say that definitely in their mindset, they were talking about a period which I think is pretty much on par with the ancient Egyptians, as in like it did stretch back several 10,000, maybe 20,000 years, and brought it all the way back to to let's say 1,000 years or so, really before the start of historical times for ancient Greece.
Now, I'm just sitting here laughing, and I may be wrong, but you said that the Greeks didn't have that finite timeline, but aren't they the ones that brought math to the world? Mathematics?
Well, that's all this according to the historians they did. But here's the funny thing, like, we give them the credit for pi and phi, and we place it with the Pythagoras and all of these other big names, which if you open an encyclopedia or Wikipedia, are credited with it. Standard historians say that pi is an invention. Well, it's not an invention, but a discovery of the Greeks. Well, pi was used in the construction of the Great Pyramid. Pi was also used in the construction of megalithic monuments like Stonehenge and various other ones. Professor Aubrey Burle is one of them, who found that so many stone circles across Western Europe incorporate pi in their construction. So those structures were built in 3000, 4000 BC if you adhere to a classic historian's interpretation. So even though textbooks continue to give the ancient Greeks credit for all of these mathematical discoveries, it's a fact that other cultures older than the Greeks were using all of this. So again, there is such a difference between what as standard, academics are. This is not something which is like a challenge to science, so to speak, that the megalithic culture or Egypt was using pi. These are conclusions reached by standard academics as well. But the textbooks lag behind into really incorporating this material.
Now, we've all studied Greek mythology in school, as we talked about a little while ago. But where did the concept of gods come from in the first place? I mean, did mankind find the need to create their own deities to worship from the very beginning, or were they presented with deities of the extraterrestrial kind? Because why would people feel the need for an almighty figure superior to, let's say, the elder in the tribe? It's like, must man, no matter how up the ladder, need someone to answer to?
I think there has to be a difference between God with a big G and gods. And to some extent, when you go in search of analyzing all of these stories, you actually find that the small gods with a small g quite often actually end up talking about the God with a big G. The ancient Greeks is not the best example of this, but definitely in ancient Egypt is an example of this. And the standard stories of the civilizing gods, the Oannes of Babylonian tradition, Quetzalcoatl in the Mayan world, Viracocha in South America, all of these deities really are described as civilizing gods. They are gods who gave mankind knowledge about astronomy, about mathematics. Everything to do with civilization was deemed to be a gift of the gods, and to some extent as to what happened to the soul. What is this thing about reincarnation? In Asia, even techniques like yoga were said to be given by mankind by the gods. Now that is different from the ancient Greeks. The ancient Greek gods are very much of the war kind facility, and to some extent what seems to have happened is that there is no real uniformity as to what was happening across the world. Now, some of the Greek myths, you can start doing comparison to Roman myths. You can start even doing comparison to myths from Northern Europe, and so the question is there an influence, or were they trying to, on some occasions, trying to shoehorn certain deities from one pantheon into another? And the short answer is that to some extent everything was going on, but there seemed to be regional variations. And so what the ancient Greeks seem to have witnessed happening in their area where they came from, or to some extent in Greece as well, was different from what was happening elsewhere in the world. And the ancient Greeks definitely seem to have had scenes which they remembered as creatures who were quite warlike, who were quite temperamental, who seem to have had an awful lot of family problems, which involved an awful lot of fighting, and as a consequence, their myths, their stories of their origins focus on that more, whereas other stories, like the ancient Egyptians, were more of like, okay, the gods lived here. It were thousands of years. There were some problems. Seth was a nasty character, but it wasn't as extreme as what the ancient Greeks were describing. So, it suggests that what was happening around the world, that various creatures were in some parts of the world and not in other parts of the world. And then, of course, you have tribes and various other cultures who have memories of deities, but it's also quite clear that those deities are non-physical, that they are to some extent animistic, that they are really creatures of another dimension, that they are creatures who belong to a very primordial time. The Aboriginals comes to mind. So you have this wide variety, and so you can't heap them all into one category, as some ancient alien authors try to do, whereby they try to say that Earth seems to have been dominated by just kind of like, one kind of extraterrestrial group, and that all civilizations seem to have different stories about these beings. To some extent, that just doesn't work. It's not that simple.
Okay. Well, let's take the concept of gods one step farther, from those we may have created in our minds, or they may have, to those who actually might have been real, as in alien gods or deities. I mean, this kind of goes back to those science fiction tales we spoke about a moment ago. When did the concept of aliens, perhaps being the actual gods, first come to light?
It's an interesting and a hard question. To some extent, it might not have happened within their lifetime, so to speak. The people like the ancient Greeks, what they were writing, they were saying these gods are factual, and then somewhere down the line, people began to believe that these gods were fantasy, or not as human, or not as physical as the ancient Greeks held them to be. There's a very big prophecy in the Egyptian material called the Lament, and basically it's a story about how in Greek times there is this. It's not a real conversation, but it is it's a lament. It's basically a piece written whereby a priest sits down to write and has a conversation with the god Hermes, and the priest and Hermes lament that at one point in the future, Egypt will become a land where all the people will see are ruins and basically dead people, i.e. the mummies. And this priest and his god says, those people will never understand that the statues of the gods in ancient Egypt walked, that we spoke directly to the gods, and that there even was a time before our time when the gods were physically present in ancient Egypt. And I find it a beautiful little rendition, because it is so true. We have lost our ways, in the sense that we believe that our ancestors all believed in certain things which was either not real, or in a more liberal interpretation, that some people believe that indeed they were talking about creatures on another plane of existence. But again, the ancient Greeks are amongst those people who say our history is history. We are not writing about myths and legends. We are, the original sense of a legend, also involves what we quite often give sports people. He was a legend because he was larger than life. He was He was great. He was memorable. He was a person who was going to go down into the memories of people for times to come. We have them. We have them. The Kennedy, the death of President Kennedy is legendary. It doesn't mean it's made up that somehow Kennedy didn't get assassinated or that Kennedy didn't die. It's legendary because it so stands out, and that's a meaning which we know and use today. But we seem to have forgotten that it is actually the meaning of the legends themselves. They stood out, these stories stood out because generations of ancient Greeks would talk about it and would be aware of it and would tell other people about it. And so where did it go wrong when it comes to the ancient Greeks? It seems to have happened somewhere roughly around the 5th 4th century, when the Greeks became extraordinarily rational, when they began to argue certain things away, when people who in ancient Greece themselves were saying, really, these things, that they are real. Other Greeks began to say, like, they can't be real. Our ancestors were just these things. Like that, something happened in ancient Greece, roughly in the 5th, 4th century BC, where rationality seemed to spun out of control. And the rational mindset which we have today, which quite often explains things away rather than explaining things, that really can be traced back to that mindset as well. To that time frame as well. It's something which the Greeks invented or created, and it is also the period in time for the Greeks when the heroes and the legends became a thing of science fiction rather than a thing of reality. But across the world it is in different time frames depending on where you stand.
Mm-hmm. Now there are a couple of things that point to the fact that mankind in ancient times was way more technologically advanced than any of us had a right to think that they could be in our modern way of thinking. For example, there were apparently weapons of mass destruction used in times before history began. Lots to do with alignment of certain planets, constellations, stars in the galaxy, which broaches the question, how else could prehistoric man or early man have learned about technology and astronomy that far back?
Well, it's one of those big questions. And one of the interesting things I think about astronomy specifically is that when you look up in the sky, you see thousands of little speckles of light, and we have organized these things into a completely arbitrary construct called constellations and zodiacs, whereby we say, okay, we're going to divide the region of the equator roughly in 12 parts, and we're going to work with these things. Now we're being told that this is this is completely random, and we are being somehow told that these civilizations did it all by themselves. But things like Orion's constellation is something which the people of Mexico use. It's something which the people of South America use, the Incas use. It's across the world. The Orion constellation has been identified as the Orion constellation. And that is not just applying to the Orion constellation. It pretty much applies to all constellations. Sometimes, and even within Western civilization, certain constellations were deemed to be so big that they were broken down into smaller chunks. But when it comes to grouping them, again, what could be completely arbitrary, and you would expect that every civilization, specifically as they develop completely independent of each other, would have done it their own way, you're actually finding a homogeneous picture across the world. And so clearly that suggests that this happened an awful long time ago. So two approaches here. One of them is that we have to go back to the beginnings of mankind, and one of the first things they did 20, 30, 40,000 years ago, before when there were very few of them, that they decided these were the ways the constellations were going to be. But then also for extraordinary amounts of time, our ancestors stuck with that. So again, this is always what intrigued Erich. And even though Erich has gone down into history as the father of ancient aliens, he always, early on in Chariots of the Gods, said that he was quite confident, and some of the questions he was raising were going to have answers which didn't suggest that on those specific things ET hadn't been there or ET hadn't been involved, but that the answer would show that there was a higher technological capability present amongst our ancestors. And so in the case of astronomy, you're not really dealing with a higher technological capability, so to speak. You're dealing with a body of knowledge about the stars and how they were organized. So at this level of astronomy, you could say, okay, astronomy, again, scientists will tell you that all of these things happened in ancient Greek times, that there is no evidence of anything prior. Well, if that's the case, please explain as to how around the world, everywhere, the constellations were done in the same times, in the same manner. So again, it's either thousands of years, in this case 20,000 years old, that mankind did this division and then stuck to it. Now, when you go and dig into it a bit deeper, all the myths, or many civilizations say that the astronomy was a gift of the gods, that non-human intelligences told them this. And also when you start looking into Mayan, I go into this in my own book, The Ancient Alien Question, into some detail. When you go into the Mayan mythology and the in the Mayan calendar and Babylonian calendars, you're confronted with time frames which are millions of years old, and which interlap as well. Like you have Mayan cycles which are 20 times a cycle of a Babylonian cycle, and this is advanced things. You can. This is like, it's way too complex to go into this interview, but again, it's written out in the book. And in this case, what happens is that it's clear that our ancestors had been told by somebody about these cycles, that some of them are literally million years long. And now we're very early on in the exploration of these things, but what is apparent is that some of these cycles seem to be linked to geological events. When you are confronted with geologists, some of them are saying these things happen roughly every 8 million years. And Tada, some of the cycles from the Mayans and the Babylonians talk about 8 million years as well. So of course at this moment in time it's fairly early on to say, okay, these two are completely related, but it's clear that our ancestors knew certain things and knew with such mathematical precision that they were, either extraordinarily advanced to the extent that they had had to have relied on some kind of satellite imagery. And you find that in so many cultures. The Celts were one who were able to define the center of the British Isles within a few hundred yards of what we are able to do with satellite imagery. And so they had a science which was able to map Britain, the British Isles, to an extraordinarily degree. And again, they either had the most precise land-based measuring system, which would then be truly a lost science, or really it was a legacy of somebody who did have satellite imagery at their disposal and basically said, okay, that's the center there if you ever want to work with that. And so to some extent we can pinpoint really certain things and say, okay, this is definitely within the alien realm. To another extent, you're confronted with the conclusion that our ancestors were either extraordinarily aware, had extraordinary sciences at their disposal, which might have been without the help of high technology or without the intervention of ET. But to some extent at that moment in time, the conclusion is that this non-technological non-ET helped science is actually more complex to execute than with the help of these non-human intelligences, because try to explain how people could find the center of Britain, which is an island, which also therefore means that it kind of like the sea has taken and given a bit in certain places. Hence, you could actually say that at the moment in time of Celtic times, it was precisely the center which they were able to define, and that simply Britain as a shape has slightly changed since the past 3,000 years. Anyway, trying to come up with the answer as to how in Celtic times people were able to identify the center of Britain without the help of all of these things might actually be a harder task than allowing for ET intervention.
Mm-hmm. Now I've got a question from the chat room. Cece wants to know, why are so many of the old monuments and circles, etc., built near burial mounds? What's your opinion on that?
It's a very big question mark. I have just been reading a book and interviewed the person himself, and his name is actually Robert Langdon. But he's not from the Da Vinci Code, but he's an archaeologist, and he's written a book which is basically called the Stonehenge Enigma, and his way of going about these things is basically that some of these monuments are older than we think they are, and in the case of Stonehenge, he's actually been able to date it to 8,000 BC. Actually, because archaeological discoveries recent archaeological discoveries when they were making the car park actually showed that some of these things date back that far. And everything in archaeology, when it comes to big stone circles, has to be done through comparative dating, because you can't date stone. The stone is millions of years old. The question is, when was it carved out? And for that, people look at tools which were left behind or burials which were left behind. However, because he has really been looking at the wood which has been used in the same time frame as these stone monuments, you can date the wood, and so the wood has allowed him to date Stonehenge to 8,000 BC. And I mean, this is a long story to answer the question, but basically what his conclusion is, and this is something which will need to be developed in the future, is that quite a bit of these burials were later, that the stones date back to 8,000 in the case of Stonehenge, obviously not in all cases, but that most of these megalithic stones are quite a bit older than we currently give them credit for, and that in later times some of the artifacts, the mounds which were linked with these monuments were actually later additions, that people began to bury their dead near there. In some cases, some of these objects were used in funerary things, but overall, his thinking and an awful lot of other people's thinking is that people wanted to be buried close to these monuments because these monuments were important for their ancestors, and so they wanted to be close to their ancestors. And so what in origin really didn't have any specific funerary purpose, over time, when the people who had built the monuments really had died themselves for a few thousand years ago, there was this tradition happening that people said, oh, we want to be buried close to them. It's very much on par with, if you could, and this is actually happening in ancient Egypt as we speak, the locals who live near the Great Pyramid to this very day are buried in a cemetery, a Muslim cemetery near the pyramids, but that village and that cemetery, go forward in time 5,000 years ago. If they don't have our records, they might think that they were buried there for reasons to do with the pyramids, and that's simply not the case. It just so happens that they lived locally, and that was the place where they wanted to be buried. So it's an extraordinarily interesting question, and we're slowly untangling it, but it takes a while.
Now, I want to go talk for a minute about the origin of mythical creatures such as the centaur, the cyclops. It's speculated that they're a result, if they were actually real, of breeding between man and alien. Is that a fair assumption?
It's definitely, when you start taking the accounts into consideration, that definitely certain things were being done on a genetic experimentation level, and clearly most of these results weren't very satisfactory. An awful lot of them were kind of like thrown out. It was like, okay, that's not a good idea, and they are also to an extent so weird, so bizarre, that it does point to the conclusion that what we are confronted there is again something of genetic manipulation, of genetic engineering, and obviously successful genetic engineering has gotten an awful lot of success. Things like maize in the Mexican Altiplano was done 3,000 years ago, and to some extent, 5,000 years ago, 3,000 BC, and to some extent how it was done, we don't know. There are even suggestions that it's far older, that we might have to push it back to 8,000 BC. Things like the dogs and the cats, that's part of mankind's genetic engineering in creating these creatures. To an extent right now, that we are confronted with animals who sometimes, we have to pay thousands and thousands of dollars for. And the reason actually is that there has been so much breeding, but we're also paying so much money for a creature really which is, not that well. A pug, has an awful lot of things really wrong with them. It's hard to breathe. If I'm not mistaken, they also have some problems with their joints. And this is true, genetic breeding, and so what we're seeing in the historical record is that there is a tradition which basically says that such breeding happened, that other creatures, the gods, were doing various kinds of experiments and also said like, yeah, that's not a good idea. Let's not do that. And that in some instances they were happy with the result, or that in some instances there were one-offs whereby either they felt that they couldn't continue with that, or maybe that it's simply, or the end result of what they had created simply could not, from a genetic point of view, procreate on its own. So yes, there is this body of material out there, which definitely does suggest that weird things were happening.
Mm-hmm. And also in the book, I found this kind of fascinating in reading about the earliest Olympic Games, that all the contestants competed in the nude so that the spectators knew they were human. At that time, in people's minds, what else could they have been?
Well, and it's an interesting thing, and I mean, what I'm going to relate to this story, I have never researched myself, but because the question pops up, I'm going to relate it, and it's basically that in the Bible, I think it's Noah. At some point, Noah never, and I think Moses might have been the same, but there are some biblical characters who make it quite clear that they don't want to be seen in the naked, and I think it's Noah who's more extreme than Moses about this. And then at some point somebody does see something, and basically they see that he has certain what they describe as a scab of flesh, which to the person who sees it leaves the impression that Noah, there's something non-human in the state of Noah, so to speak, and definitely that is something which is quite uniform. The ancient Greeks were, quite specific that they wanted to see naked people to the extent that otherwise it would be an unfair competition, and so yes, there just seems to have been a visual indicator several thousand years ago amongst our ancestors, which suggests that some of them were less human or more human than others. And when you start, again, when you go into the Bible, you have this story of in Genesis, the story of the Watchers, these creatures who come from heaven and begin to mix with earthly women, and then they have descendants. And even though it says in the Bible that God sent the flood to destroy all of these creatures, then later in the Bible you find out that this either hasn't really killed everybody, or that somehow they survived through some other means. But they begin to tell you that outside of when the Jews basically are leaving Egypt and coming to the Promised Land, it wasn't virgin territory. There were people living there, and so in the Bible you can see descriptions of tribes who are living there, and quite often they will say, "Oh yeah, those people were the survivors of this tribe of the Watchers with those things." And by the way, they were like giants. So as Israelites, really had to excel ourselves into slaying these beings who were, much taller and on occasion clearly not just taller, but also had other distinguishing marks of saying that these were not really as normal human as we would think they are. So it's something which you find in the Middle East. The Middle East obviously is not that far from ancient Greece. So it's something which was around definitely in 2000, 1000, and definitely the Olympic records push it out as far as 8th century BC. When it disappeared completely is a question which I think we should really look to with science for answering, and science of course is not interested, because science has relegated all of these stories to the fiction file. So unless science is really beginning to look at it on a more factually interested basis, none of our ancestors' genetics are going to be analyzed from that point of view. But if we are continuing to do excavations in the Middle East, and if we were to come upon certain skeletons which show genetic anomalies, that I think would be a great time to actually start looking into really how different genetically these skeletons would be from normal human, because at that moment in time what we are beginning to do is do real scientific research, and it's a scientific research which basically goes out from the understanding that our ancestors were not as homogeneously human as we would think they were.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that there's a way, anyway, to quantify mythology versus scientific evidence as far as an alien present in ancient Greece or even earlier is concerned? Or do you think it will always be just pure speculation?
I don't think it will always be pure speculation. I think at some point it might become extremely hard to prove, but that is basically largely dependent on, circumstances. I think in the next 5 to 10 years, if science does embrace or is forced to embrace a more open-minded attitude and is forced to look into certain things and has funding to do some of these things, then I think we are in a position whereby we can definitely move forward. Of course, we will never be able to prove every single detail of everything. It's like Troy, when the story of Troy was believed to be a complete myth, it was thought that it never existed. And then Schliemann said, well, I don't buy that. And he basically identified a town as Troy. Now, when you say, okay, so we have now identified that Troy and the history of Troy is factual, then you can say, well, then the events which happened in Troy are factual as well. But at some point, even in our own time, we know that when you look at the history of Obama, we will have certain things right and we will have certain things not right. We don't know what Obama had last night for dinner, and very few people know. And if that at some point becomes important, well, then there will be a level of uncertainty about what Obama really had for dinner. If somebody's alone, it's a matter of speculation. But there are levels of graduation. Like at this moment in time, we know Obama is the president of America. And so that is kind of like the story of Troy as well. At this moment in time, we know that the story of Troy is factual. And basically, we therefore know that this story, which was once believed to be a myth, now has been proven to be a fact. And that, I think, is really the most important thing. That is scientific validation that the myths were real. Whether our historical account is 100% real, in some cases, I think we will never be able to show that. But we do have to push, I think, as far back as possible and try to identify as much as, or identify and verify as much as possible as we can, even though at some point we will, on some occasions, we'll have to say, okay, we don't know about this thing. But when it comes to the ET factor, I think genetics are our friend. We have, fortunately dug up so many things, and we have subjected so few of those things to detailed genetic analysis, that I think if we are going to do this in the future, then we're going to come up with interesting answers.
Great. Well, we're just about out of time, and I've got more questions, which we'll have to wait for another time, perhaps. But before we go, can you let people know where they can find out more about you and your books and maybe other projects that you're involved in? And so many people in chat were saying how much they love the Ancient Alien show. Will there be a new series?
There will be a new series. In fact, there might be several more series. So the show will go on. As to myself, they can go to my website, which is philipcoppens.com, which is PHILIPCOPPENS. If they type that into Facebook or Twitter or even things like Google+, they will come to me as well. I have written a book called The Ancient Alien Question, which is with the same publisher as Erich's Odyssey of the Gods, and those books can be found on Amazon. They can also be found in Barnes & Noble. In short, you can buy these books wherever books are available for sale.
Great. Well, I want to thank you so much for being here, and I want to thank everybody who listened in as well. And we've got to run, so until next time, everybody, blessed be, and merry meet again. Good night.
This has been another edition of Stirring the Cauldron with Marla Brooks. Be sure to tune in next week at the same time for another great guest and more fun. Any rebroadcast or other use